Okay, all right. Oh, there we are. All right. I'm having a conversation with Benjamin Zander, conductor Benjamin Zander, and a million other things. Speaker, TED speaker, lecturer, genius, brilliant, etc., etc. Goes on and on and on. He's a wonderful man. And we are Benjamin Zander is conductor of the Boston Philharmonic. We're speaking to him in Cambridge, I believe, in his home in Cambridge. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yep.
I'm okay so far. And Benjamin also conducts the Philharmonic Orchestra in London regularly and has made many recordings with them. And we're going to be speaking about an historic recording that Benjamin has just finished. And I'm going to call him Ben from here on out. Benjamin, it's just too many syllables. We are speaking about a new recording. It is definitive, and I do not mean, as we have spoken, you and I, this is not about ego. It is not about, this is my version, this is how I think it should be. This is definitive proof. This recording of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, about how Beethoven absolutely intended it to be performed. And there are shockers. And all of us in the profession and those who eavesdrop on the mysteries of Beethoven and classical music know that there have been controversies about his hair, about how he died, eating off pewter, and all kinds of things, mostly true. But there's been this big controversy about Beethoven's metronome markings and whether he was out of his mind or not. And Ben Zander, with the help of many other scholars, of course, I'm looking at Stuart Young's doctoral thesis that you mentioned, have found definitive proof that tempos and the new instrument, the metronome, were very, very, very important to Beethoven and to other composers as they discovered this wonderful instrument to allow them to help performers understand what they really intended. Ben, go ahead. Let's kind of get started on this so I can keep my mouth shut for a bit.
Well, I would like to start with this word definitive because many people naturally and rightly feel affronted by the idea that there could be a definitive performance of any great work of art, because after all, in the end, it's only the momentary realization by individual people or by groups of people. And so I'm a little wary of definitive. What I would say is that this is an honest attempt to realize, as far as we possibly can know, what Beethoven might have intended. Now, that sounds a little bit less strong than your definitive characterization. I think your enthusiasm for it is well-founded. It's an extraordinarily exciting recording, and I spent a great deal of time explaining in two separate discs why I came to these conclusions and why I believe that fervently that Beethoven would have endorsed those decisions, because he gave us so much evidence. First of all, that he cared deeply about tempo. That tempo was the character of the piece, came from the tempo. And it's very clear, because if you take the opening of the Fifth Symphony, pa 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 pa, pa pa pa, it's fate knocking on the door. If you do it at the tempo which he marked it, it's pa 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 pa, pa 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 pa, and it's, as one critic wrote, leaning on the doorbell. In other words, it has a totally different character, different meaning, different effect, and different result in terms of the whole structure of the piece. So Beethoven himself was very adamant that once the metronome was discovered, invented, and brought to his attention, joyously he was able to say, now at last people are going to be able to play this music, my music, at the tempo that I want and that I specified, which already they are not doing. Now, in his own time, he was complaining that they didn't observe the metronome marks. The reason for that is twofold, I think. One is, people don't like mechanical instruments. They think it hampers the fantasy, the spontaneity, the musical energy, and the expression of the artist to be tied down to a metronome. In that, they're right, if you follow the metronome rigorously and meticulously, as if it was a machine beating through the piece. What it does is it gives us a groundwork, a scaffold for the piece of music. So, for instance, in the first movement, it's marked allegro ma non troppo, and it's given the metronome 88. Now that is a great deal faster than almost anybody plays it. I say almost anybody because actually John Eliot Gardner does it at that tempo, and Toscanini does it somewhat, in other words, some parts of it. But if you take 88, I've got a little piano here, so there's nothing wrong with that tempo. It's energetic, it's brilliant, and it is also maestoso. It's also majestic, and that's what he wrote. He wrote allegro, ma non troppo, and poco maestoso. So it's spirited and majestic at the same time. If you do it slower, it may be majestic, but it won't be that spirited, vital, driven, exciting, world-shattering energy which Beethoven characteristically brought to the picture. So the other reason why musicians don't follow metronome marks in general is because they don't believe that the tempo is as crucial as the dynamics, the notes, the slurs, all those things. They think the tempo is something that belongs to the individual musician, and that it's up to the musician to decide, not up to the composer. And Brahms felt the same way. Brahms said, once I finish the piece, it's yours to play as you want.
Yeah, Beethoven... but that was that whole romantic misdirection, if you will. And by the way, I've been a musician a lot of my life, really, since I was 15, 14. I really always took the tempi markings with a grain of salt. You see what I mean? That exactly as you've described, just kind of like, but my expressive voice will find the true answers, which is all true, of course. But the importance of metronome markings, especially at that period, in the classic period when the instrument had been discovered, this magical instrument that could free composers of the generic Italian terms, so they could be more specific.
Beethoven's metronome marks work wonderfully for certain things without any question. Like, for instance, the second movement, the scherzo. Everybody more or less plays that movement at that tempo and has no difficulty with it. It's 116, and in his, I have here the markings that he wrote in the conversation book.
A little higher, just so we can see.
There we go.
A little bit higher above your. There we go. Something. Oh, look at that. Yes, amazing.
And it's very clear. 116 is the tempo there, and it's a tempo that virtually everybody plays. I mean, maybe a little bit slower, a little bit more fast, but basically, so no problem with that. And there are several other tempi in this piece that actually are perfectly acceptable, about 6 of them, but it's the others that is the problem. Now, if you
so what began the questioning? Why, if everyone was happy with the tempi that work, were they so outraged and reject the others?
Yes, I think they took no notice of the tempo marking. They just came up with it because it felt natural. Now, the thing that's so interesting about Beethoven is he wasn't interested in the natural. He was interested in the unusual. And he said the old tempo markings, the tempi ordinario, like presto and allegro and andante, were simply insufficient for the wildly imaginative and original creative genius and new vision that he was bringing. So now if you take the opening of the symphony, the Romantics saw it as the primordial forces of the universe, sounding in the distance at the beginning of time and so on, whatever they thought. And they came up with this magical idea, very slow. And it's timeless and wonderful and atmospheric. And of course, Bruckner, the height of the Romantic era, took that idea and created 5 symphonies beginning that way. And so that idea of Beethoven as the Romantic came to dominate, and then people started feeling more and more possessive about his music until we got the period of questioning. And in my own life, that happened around 1972. That's long before the HIP, the hip people, the Norrington and John Ellicott and all those wonderful musicians. That was all much later in the 80s. But about 1972, I came across the very work you mentioned, Stuart Young's dissertation. Sadly, tragically, we've lost him. He died at the end of the summer. But he and I had a relationship which went back to 1972. And Rudolf Kolisch, who was the great leader of the Kolisch String Quartet, believed fervently not only in the metronome arts of Beethoven, but also of Schoenberg and of Berg and of Bartók. And Schoenberg apparently interrupted a rehearsal in which he reprimanded the quartet for playing 128 instead of 132. I mean, he had, without consulting his metronome. I mean, so for some composers, not all, but for some composers, the tempo was absolutely crucial. And we know for a fact that Beethoven felt that way. And what I did for the recording with the Philharmonia is I played a little game. I imagined that Beethoven was in the balcony. He was sitting there, and I know exactly what he looked like, and I would look up frequently into the balcony, and sometimes he would be nodding his head, and sometimes he would go like that. But I kept in my mind that this was not an ego trip for me. This was an act of homage for Beethoven. That, in other words, I would use not only one of the greatest orchestras in the world, the Philharmonia Orchestra, one of the greatest choruses in the world. Stefan Bevier trained that chorus to a level of perfection that is rarely achieved by mankind, maybe by the angels, and then 4 great soloists. And I used every bit of my knowledge, my experience, my passion, my love to devote to realizing what it was that Beethoven had in mind as I understood it. Now, if you take the opening, instead of playing it very slow and amorphous like Bruckner, what I did is I took the tempo that he gave, 88, turned it into 44, which he didn't have on his metronome, so he couldn't have written 44, but he meant 44 at the beginning. And even in the back of my mind, I was thinking 22. So very slow. Now what happens? The notes get closer and closer together. And then closer. And then and suddenly you get this, what is like climbing a gigantic mountain to the summit. And by starting slowly, and I explained to the orchestra in the rehearsals, I said, I'm not going to conduct this in the usual way. You're going to have to find the beat, because I'm doing it so slowly to create the illusion. And that's what I believe Beethoven intended. The illusion of slowness without actually playing a slow tempo. And when we got to that, finally that great D minor arrival, it is just simply overwhelming power is released and intensity. And many members of the orchestra sort of looked in amazement as if to say, I had no idea that this is what Beethoven. It was thrilling. The timpani player, I mean, he almost lost it. He was so excited.
Now listen, let me jump in. While we're right,
Beethoven was sitting in the balcony and he went,
I can imagine. By the way, let's just let me jump in for a moment, because I want to ask now about the it wasn't an easy lesson for some musicians. Not that they resisted you particularly, but just the idea. Can you give us a little anecdote about I believe the oboist who said, I just can't.
Well, the wonderful thing with the oboist, and he's a great player, the first oboe. He came in at it from a different position. He said, I can't play it at that time. This is the famous trio. The trio of the Ninth Symphony, very, very complicated. Let me just explain here. Here you have it. Can you see it? 116. Do you see the 116?
A little higher. We had it a moment ago. Yeah, I see it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the second number is also 116.
Yes.
Well, you see that clearly?
Yep.
That is the scherzo and the trio. Well, it's clearly the same tempo.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. Now, the problem is that Carl, the nephew, who was working with him, made a little mistake, and he put in, instead of writing just 116, he added a single half note instead of realizing that it applied to the whole bar. If you play it the whole bar, it's very, very, very fast. And the great oboist said, look, I can't play that. I certainly can't play it musically. But I want to show you something very funny. This is one of my students in my youth orchestra. You've heard the youth orchestra. You know how they play, right? This is a young fellow. He's called Rodion Belousov. He's a Russian. And I sent him a note. I said, Rodion, how close can you get to Beethoven's tempo? And about 40 minutes later, he sent this little, on the telephone.
Yeah, let's hear it.
He put a metronome on at 116. That's Beethoven's tempo.
No problem. Apparently.
And you know what he said? No problem. And he wrote in his note, he said, Mr. Zander, no problem. And I can do it just as well at 120.
Use.
And it's musical. It's musical. It sounds lovely. It sounds natural.
These understandings of the proper tempi have brought this symphony to life for me. There's no way I'll ever go back to the old.
That's
and we discussed it earlier, and we don't want to spend too much time on it, but the idea of the influence of recordings, really, in the 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, the idea that a certain grip, that late romantic conductors of all that, you mentioned Bruckner and so on, that style of conducting and of composition, this kind of hung over into the performances, as we know, of even Beethoven, Schubert, all of those composers.
And what's so thrilling about this, here's an older man, and he's getting towards the end of his life, and he knows that. He's sick, he's deaf, he's weighed down by sorrow and difficulty and struggles of all kinds. And he creates a world that he had dreamed of all his life, a world of the brotherhood of man, where all mankind is unified together. And he puts together a great drama in music. And the question is, does the tempo that he set for each section realize that dream more fully than what so many of the conductors, great music, all
have? Speak to me about the march, because we're right there. The march. You tell us how we have been used to hearing it, and then the eyewitness reports that reported otherwise, and so on. Is that okay?
Exactly.
I'd love to hear about that. That's a great idea.
The last movement, and I have to tell you two things about the march. First of all, I have to tell you that just before the march happens, there is a very shocking thing in this performance. And the reason is because I was told by Stuart Young that in the library, in the London Library, was a score, an original score that Sir George Smart used for his first performance. And it had on the famous last note of the word "zu Gott." It builds, the chorus builds, "zu Gott, zu Gott, zu Gott." And that's, up till that point, the loudest, most climactic moment in Western music. And always sung at full volume by everybody, and still to this day. However, Beethoven added a diminuendo on that note. And I went to the library because I didn't believe it. I simply couldn't believe it.
I'm stunned as you tell me, even now.
But it is. There it is. It's quite clear. And when the Philharmonia did that diminuendo, it was spine-chilling. I mean, it was, 120 or 140 singers together making a disciplined, beautiful diminuendo of the note. It absolutely said, once you've heard it, I mean, it's just an incredible experience. And that brings you now to the pianissimo world of the stars. Now, this is another of those controversies. It's written allegro assai vivace, which means very fast. The metronome mark is dotted crotchet, or dotted quarter note, equals 84, but it's mistaken. It's one of those mistakes that unfortunately slipped in. Again, Carl, Beethoven wrote 6/8 84. That's all he wrote. Carl added the quarter note, and that has confused everybody because it's much too slow, and everybody ignores it and says it's nonsense, of course. But what we did was did it at 84 to the bar, which is clearly what's intended, and it's oompa, 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 and it's fantastic, and it's a perfect ceremonial march in Beethoven's day would have been done in that way, and it's thrilling. And we got everybody to play very soft, pianissimo, the winds as it's marked, as if they're in the far distance, and describing the stars. And then the tenor sings, oh, oh, wie deine Song. He sings pianissimo, which is
Also,
unheard of.
yes, also in awe. Uh,
You know,
and is that in the marking? Is that pianissimo in the markings?
everybody's
Brilliant.
pianissimo. It's pianissimo.
Because we
Nothing.
know how it's usually performed, just bold tenor
They
singing.
shout it out as loud as they possibly can. But of course, it's completely wrong. He's spellbound by the glory of the firmament of the stars, because behind the stars, the good Lord, the good Father lives. And that's the other theme of the Beethoven Ninth. These two themes of the brotherhood of man, which is a secular theme, and the presence of the benign Father beyond the stars. So it's very important to create that feeling of the stars. And then comes a battle. They go into battle and war.
Right there at the battlefield.
And you
Tell
could,
the story. Tell the story.
well, to play that at the tempo that Beethoven asked us to play it is very nearly impossible. And it's the same theme, da 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 dee da da da, but instead of being 80, it's 84. So he wanted it even faster to create the absolute frantic battle circumstance. Well, we did it, and we did it at 80, and it was fine. It was fine. And the editor said, please, it's fine, leave it. And I said, Beethoven was up there in the balcony, and I said, but he wrote 84. He meant something even more than we're doing. But it was the end of the evening. We'd finished. It was 9 o'clock, end of the recording. And so I said, all right. But I tossed and turned all night, and I thought maybe I'm a complete fool trying to be so devoted to the cause that Beethoven may be just laughing at me for this. But the next morning, I arrived at the recording session, and we were about to do the slow movement. And the wonderful concert mistress, Stephanie Gormley, great musician. She's an early music specialist. And she came up to me and said, you know, if we played that on the string instead of bouncing the bow, I don't think the tempo would be a problem at all. And so I announced, much to the consternation of the orchestra, we're going to do the one more time on the march, on the fugato in the march. And we settled down. Light went on, and way through from beginning to end, and that's the recording. And just because everybody was on the string, they could realize 84 without any difficulty. And so it was like, oh my God, this genius composer, he really knew what he wanted. And so this is what we've given him. We've given him what he wanted, and it's so satisfying. It's so deeply satisfying. The one of the most dramatic things, and I'm sure you found it too, that the slow movement, which is the most indulgent movement in the tradition
in the
of
traditional performances. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we know this now finally at last, but you have proven it also with the Adagio in the Ninth Symphony. Things moved. Movement. There was movement. Things moved. That late romantic influence was not good for the Baroque realizations or this.
Yes, it was a misconception. What they thought.
Thank you.
Yeah, misconception. They thought by playing it very slow, like the beginning of
It's gorgeous.
It's very beautiful. It's beautiful, and it's beautiful there. It's like a prayer. It's sort of timeless. But there's a problem. Later on, when it builds a it just sounds awfully stuck. And so if you do it in Beethoven's, and again, it's a question of understanding how he worked. He wrote 60 for the quarter note, but of course he didn't mean 60, he meant 30. He couldn't write 30 because he didn't have it on the metronome. 50 was the lowest number. So he wrote 60, assuming you would understand that it would be 1, 2, 1, 2. It's a song. It's a love song.
It's a love song indeed. I'm glad you mentioned.
And the smile which you have on your face, that's what Beethoven, he wanted your face hearing that, because the movement, it's like Florestan singing in Fidelio, a song of love. And once you understand that and get it, and the players in the orchestra, they were just so radiant with joy, because they played it hundreds and hundreds of times. And to be released out of the cage.
And by the way, the answers are all there, as you just mentioned, in other works of Beethoven. There's really nothing surprising when you compare tempo markings and so on. It's all very sensible.
The trio, which you think is still too fast, the trio...
Just a hair, maybe.
Right, a hair. Well, it could be 1 point on the metronome, And we do, in fact, have 2 versions of it, which we recorded, one at 108 and one at 116. And I decided to use the one at 116 simply so that people could hear it. They could say, well, it's a little too fast, or it's not, or they're not used to it, or they need time to get used to it. But this is, after all, just an exploration. It's just like saying, maybe, can we at least give Beethoven
and by the way, in my listening experience, I found it fascinating that faster was clearer.
Yeah.
Somehow these faster tempi are much clearer. You understand intention and structure and architecture. It just all makes such perfect sense. So definitive is not such a bad word to use here. Come on.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of trying, let me give you one other example of Beethoven composed something that he didn't mean. There's a fanfare in the slow movement. Ba ba bum ba. Ba ba pee, ba ba pee, ba ba pee, ba ba pee. Now he had a B flat and an F on the timpani, but he didn't have an E flat, so he couldn't do da da dee da da dee ba ba pee. He couldn't do that note, and then he could do this dum ba ba pee dum ba ba ba. So he just puts timpani notes on the F and on the B flat and the F. But it makes no sense. Of course, on a modern timpani, you can change the notes, and so we put those notes in. Now, when you hear it, and also at a proper tempo, ba ba bum, ba ba pee, ba ba bum.
Wait a moment. Time out. Do I now understand that you added?
Yeah, we added timpani notes.
I am thrilled, but you'll have to make sure we all know that. Those of us who will, I'm too old now, but those others who will reinterpret the piece, of course. Modern instrument, he would have used it, no doubt.
Once you hear it, you cannot hear it any other way. It's impossible. It's utterly pedantic to say, oh, but Beethoven didn't write it. Well, of course he didn't write it, because he didn't have the bloody notes on his tip. The same is true for some of the Heinrichs and the flute and the bassoon, where he didn't have those notes. He didn't trust those notes to be played in tune, so he put them an octave lower. But we put them back up, of course, and we do all the dynamics that he asked, all the dynamics, sometimes outrageously demanding dynamics. And then there's one other thing I have to tell. Do we have a second? One second.
Sure we do. I was just trying to figure out what I might have forgotten to mention, but I think we've pretty well covered it.
We've covered
many things.
We
don't even speak about the last movement if you want to.
Not so much. But the thing is, the reason I took 2 discs, actually over 2 hours, in order to explain this is the most important piece of music, the most influential piece of music in the world. Why shouldn't we I spent 40 years on it. Stuart Young spent his life on it. Why shouldn't we ask the listener to settle down in a comfortable chair and listen to all the story of, it's almost like a detective story, finding out all these things. But at the
And by the
end,
way, this is not a vanity project. This is not you just spouting. This is you producing proofs. Let's just
right.
be very clear. It's marvelous. By the way, it's a fully fledged, magnificent deluxe set with the 2 CDs of your lectures on all of these issues and many, many more that we haven't time to deal with, and then this definitive
Well, I'm thrilled.
performance.
I'm thrilled to have discovered you because you are the ideal enthusiast. That's what we want in life. Enthusiasm, which means you know that enthusiasm means being full of God. That's what theo is God. So all I ask in my students and in my players and in my audience is the shining eyes that come from enthusiasm. And you're a perfect example of that. And thank goodness that you're bringing it out to more people, because that's all that matters. Shining eyes is all that matters. Wealth and fame and power have no value, but shining eyes is what life is about. And this music creates more shining eyes and more exuberance and joy and gratitude for life than any other piece of music.
And revelation is good. Understanding, finally, is good.
Let me just tell you one more thing
Sure.
here to show you the sky. You can't see it, but here there are. This is
Well, it's
good.
interesting to see this score and just to see how a conductor functions about these things.
So if you write Götterfunken, Götterfunken, here there are 30-second notes. You see that 30-second note?
Yep.
Here there are eighth notes. They're the same. They're the same. But nobody's realized that. So everybody makes a complete muddle of this passage. And this is the first time, I believe, that it's ever been correctly realized. Because it's so clear that the chorus is supposed to sing Götterfunken, Götterfunken. How could it be anything else? But it means making these 30 seconds and these 16ths identical. And we did that. And then you hear in the 16 da 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 da, and that's the main theme. It's so beautiful. Anyway, all this is described in the discussion disc. So anybody who is interested and has a couple of hours to listen, they can delve into it. And I think what they will get is a much greater understanding in how music works. That's my hope, that they will get insight into the workings of the musical language, the grammar of music, so that people understand not only this piece, but other pieces that they're playing and learning and loving.
Let me bring it down now. Thank you very much for the compliments. By the way, thank you very much for a TED Talk. This was brilliant. I am thrilled to have you give me this gift of your brilliant mind. It's such a thrill always chatting with Benjamin Zander. We are talking about his new recording. I'll try and hold back on the word definitive, but this is like the truth. The real truth about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Look at that. Look at this set. Yeah, look at that. It's just a deluxe set. 2 CDs. Ben explains in beautiful illustrations exactly how the discoveries have been made and why this recording is so important. Brattle Media release 2018. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with the Philharmonic Orchestra in London. Let's see, Stéphane Bevier, the choir master, soloist soprano Rebecca Evans, mezzo Patricia Barden, tenor Robert Murray, bass baritone Derek Welton. What's next? I mean, what research is going on somewhere that you aren't telling us?
Yes, well, I started my my life as a Beethoven conductor 47 years ago, and we're celebrating my 80th birthday this year. And the concert is an all Beethoven concert with Coriolan Overture, the Emperor Concerto, and the Fifth Symphony. And the Fifth Symphony is where I started, and it caused a sensation 47 years ago. Nobody had ever heard of Beethoven work played at his Tempe, and
by the way, that's a tricky one. I remember as a conducting student, that's a tricky one. And as with lots of this music from this period, faster is better, I think.
Right, absolutely.
Faster is better.
It's a revelation. And I remember Michael Steinberg said, we have to rethink Beethoven from the ground up.
And Schubert and all the others. I heard a recent recording of the Great C Major Symphony. Faster tempo, practically cut time. That's exactly how it should be, no doubt. Anyway, excuse me for interrupting. Finish us out.
Well, I mean, this is a great time because now, interestingly, when Michael Steinberg said we have to think about Beethoven in a new way from the ground up. That's exactly what's happened. So now the younger generation, one of my students who's now on a big career, he said, "Oh, that's how it goes. Oh, well, I'll do that at the chance." I mean, it's just natural for the younger generation. The older generation probably won't move so easily because these habits are so deeply ingrained. But you know, it's very interesting because the Beethoven Ninth, the words are, we have to say, not alle Menschen werden Brüder, all human beings will be as brothers, but deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt. Your magic binds together what habit and fashion have torn apart.
I have a quote here. Thank you so much. How incredible. What an incredible piece of text.
That's Beethoven's message, and that's what we're doing, all of us, together.
Bravo, 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 bravi tutti.
Thank you for your shining eyes.
Thanks, Benjamin Zander. Thanks very much for giving me this time and a beautiful, beautiful discussion about Beethoven's masterpiece for all time, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony.
It's a
Bye-bye.